உலகெங்கும் தமிழரின் பிம்பம் உங்கள் TVI.
Welcome to CrossRoads on TVI, a show that showcases the Tamil Canadian community, their issues and their successes. I'm your host, Manjula Salvaraja. We have a wonderful show for you today. We'll start with interviewing the filmmaker of the documentary Silenced Voices, Tales of Sri Lankan Journalists in Exile. Then we will speak about this new revealing report out of the UN that talks about their failures in Sri Lanka. Let's get started. Beate Arnestad is the award-winning Norwegian filmmaker of Silenced Voices, Tales of Sri Lankan Journalists in Exile, a documentary that talks about the fate and fears of journalists in Sri Lanka who try to speak the truth about the circumstances faced by minorities on the island. She has several years under her belt with Norwegian broadcaster NRK and a shelf of films that have received critical acclaim, including Telling Truths in Arusha and My Daughter the Terrorist. Here is a bit of that documentary.
We had hardly unpacked our suitcases after the wedding. Then I had to ready the house for a funeral.
මේ භීෂණයට වග කියන්න ඕනේ. ඇත්ත වශයෙන්ම
We exposed corruption week after week. We exposed military excess, and we always knew that there was danger in it.
I have my own experience where I have seen how brutal the state can be to its own so-called nation, the Sinhalese. So it's simple logic. They can of course be more than that brutal to the minorities. What we are trying to do at the moment is to get this kind of concrete evidence as much as we can to prove this is what happened in Sri Lanka while all the others were just watching and defending it.
Leaders who have been chosen by their people, they must be entitled to the goodwill and confidence of the international community.
My mission is accountability. I believe that journalists can change the world. If not, why are we there?
Beate, welcome to the show. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
Great.
Yes.
So tell us about this documentary, Silenced Voices.
Yes, it's a film about the freedom of speech and the messengers of truth, to portray how dangerous it has become it can be for journalists to tell the truth and to investigate, especially what governments are doing. The film is told as a personal encounter. As I go to Colombo, to Sri Lanka, just after 2009, and I find out, that I can't really talk to anyone because none of the journalists dares to talk to me, and I have to be very, very careful. So I have to leave, and basically, to find out what was going on, I have to look to find journalists who are in exile, and some of them, or most of them, actually live in secret exile. So it takes a long time for me to find them, and they are scared to talk to me. Eventually I land, I tell the stories of 3 Sri Lankan journalists, or 2 of them are Sinhalese and 1 is Tamil. It's their stories, why they have to flee, and how their lives have changed, and how dangerous it is, and what they found out. Yes.
Interesting. And what prompted you to do the story? Did you happen upon it? Did you actually go to Sri Lanka with the idea that you would do one on media freedom?
I actually lived in Sri Lanka for 3 years, from 2003 to 2006. That was during the ceasefire. So I was able to go into the Vani, and I eventually made the film called My Daughter the Terrorist. So I became deeply involved in the country, and especially the faith of the Tamil people there. So I returned to Norway, and My Daughter the Terrorist sort of was screened all over the world, and I went to festivals. And then by the end of 2008, it became very clear that there was not going to be a lasting peace, not to get negotiated peace. The war was resuming. And I noticed, the journalists were being killed, the journalists disappeared, all the NGO workers were thrown out of Vani, and there was really no access to information. And I followed, what the news were in the West. Was hardly anything coming out on what happened in Sri Lanka. I just heard from, the government that said, they were having, they fought with the gun in one hand and the Human Rights Charter in the other hand, and they were saving the civilian population. At the same time, I received these emails and I received videos from my Tamil network, and which told a complete different story. So I was thinking, how can I make, I really need to make a different film here, because it seems like the news is not coming out. So, I couldn't really go back. I couldn't get into the war zone. There were no journalists that dared to talk to me. Actually, no human rights worker or activist, they couldn't talk to me. I couldn't film there. So that's how I thought, maybe I should make a film about the Exile journalist to see if I managed to get the story out through them. Yeah.
Now, the Exile journalists themselves, you've met a couple now, you've followed them through your documentary. What is their state? How are they doing?
When you become, to be a journalist myself, and actually to be a journalist is an important job in a democratic society. And when your life is threatened and journalists, your fellow journalists, they disappear and they're tortured and they're killed, it's so frightening. And to have that experience and actually flee your country that you love, and you leave everybody, your family and everyone you love, to come to either in transit countries, and then you have to come to the West, and you lose your platform. Most of them, there are more than 50 journalists in exile. I think there's probably close to 70. Most of them, they lose their platform. Many don't speak the language. They don't know where to go. They don't know if they can stay. They don't know whether they don't have a guaranteed asylum. So your whole life fall apart, basically.
Did you have were there any trepidations they had about speaking openly with you?
I suppose that when you make a feature film, you can write a manuscript, and you select the characters, and you select the actors, and you sort of have full control. The journalists, I have to spend a lot of time with them, and to sort of to build up that trust. So they would talk to me, and also there was a lot of waiting to see, to put them in motion, or, I can't say, you have to do this and you have to do that, it's their life. So I have to be very patient, so it takes a lot of time. And you carefully have to select and sort of discuss with them what is suitable, what portion of your life is suitable to be on a film. So it's a long process, and you don't really know, you start the process of filming and you don't really know where you're ending, how much time it takes. So I think we were in the process. It took more or less 3 years before I was able to complete this film, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, from the trailer we just saw, it looks fantastic. I could see where the work, because relationships, I think, take a while, especially around a sensitive topic like this. So let me, as a journalist, I think it's interesting because you're a journalist, again, talking about other journalists that may not have the freedom to report on issues that they want to. What is your feeling about the status of media freedom in Sri Lanka in comparison to countries around the world?
the media freedom in Sri Lanka, has become one of the worst in Asia. It's they used to have it used to be fairly open, the media. Now it's a complete self-censorship. I think all the critical journalists have left. Those who remain there, they have to keep their mouth shut or don't criticize the government, basically.
Interesting.
So the government, I think, has turned all the journalists into some kind of propaganda.
A propaganda machine.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. What's the reception been to the film so far?
The reception has been great. Mm-hmm. Yes, it was selected for. But sort of the international premiere was in The Hague at Movies That Matters, mm-hmm. and then it was later chosen to participate at the Human Rights Watch Film Festival in New York. So I had 3 screenings at the Lankan Center this June.
Okay.
It's amazing, of course. The Tamil diaspora, they're always interested to watch a film because it's their story in many ways. And but to the Western audience, it's been sort of. If this is true, why haven't we heard about it? It's very, people hear about Iraq, the Arab Spring, and all those countries. They are inside of in the media in the West. But Sri Lankan, it's just been very difficult to sort of put up there where it kind of belongs. Because I really think that the human rights abuses that has been taking place has been massive. It's probably the worst in this century. Yes.
Why do you think that is, Beate, that you think it doesn't? I mean, you're telling me that people that are non-Tamil that come to these screenings don't, find some of the information that they're receiving surprising or they're not aware of it. Why do you think that sort of what is going on in Sri Lanka has just really not recaptured?
First of all, when the media workers are thrown out and they don't even allow, BBC and they don't allow the major networks to come in and report from there. You don't get information out. At the same time, Sri Lanka has a location that is, it's really not. It's not sort of a strategic place, for Western countries. So I think there are a lot of reasons that it hasn't really come up where it's a small country and it hasn't received the attention that it should have, and also most people go to Sri Lanka for a holiday. It's been ranked now the most intriguing, most fascinating holiday countries for among a lot of people say it's people think of Sri Lanka as a beautiful place to go for a holiday and drinking coconut drinks and go to the beaches.
And they don't understand the background.
They don't really want to know, I think. They don't really want to know.
So I wanted to actually get you to talk about one of the people that you can pick anyone, but is there a particular journalist story that you can walk our audience through? Just a little bit of what you learned about them or their troubles that I know that people will go out and see this documentary, but I was hoping that you could share one of the stories.
Well, there are 3 main characters. One is Sonali Samarasinghe. She's the widow of probably the most famous Sri Lankan journalist and editor of Sunday Leader, Lasantha Wickrematunge, who was brutally killed in January 2009. And she was supposed to be in the car with her husband. He was killed on broad daylight with 8 men on four motorcycles, and she also was forced to leave. And I think she's a very competent journalist, and she's very and she really goes after what's the international community. What are they doing, and why haven't they set off an international investigation? So that is her personal story, which is very interesting. And also there is Bashna and his wife Shamila. They're also Sinhalese writers, and they are in hiding in Germany. And Bashna is incredible also because he helps other journalists to come out. Mm-hmm. He's spent an enormous amount of time and energy to try to help his fellow journalists find asylum, find programs, and help them come out. to the West to find a safe place in the West. And he's also sort of a spokesman for journalists of democracy, and he has a website that is quite interesting. And they managed to get evidence out of Sri Lanka and expose them to the West. And Bharshana was the one that actually got the execution video out of Sri Lanka and handed it over first to NGOs and later to Channel 4, and it made sort of big news around the world. And that is basically his work, and also work from his secret network that is in Sri Lanka. There are people in Sri Lanka, among the Sinhalese, that really want these things to come out. Mm-hmm. So it's very dangerous work.
Well, I think we're all looking forward to seeing this in your documentary. Now, you have screenings coming up. I'll just let people know, because I know we'll get emails on it. So for those that are interested, there is a screening this Friday in downtown Toronto. It's hosted by PEN Canada and Amnesty International at the Robert Gill Theatre, Friday, November 3rd at 7 p.m. And there's one at Scarborough tomorrow, which will be closer to some of the folks who are watching our show. It's at the Coliseum Scarborough Cinemas, and that's at 7 p.m. on Monday as well. So I have kind of a final question for you. This is one of curiosity. What more do you think sort of the international community can do to aid these journalists?
Journalists need to find asylum. They cannot. They need there are various PEN programs. It's very difficult for journalists to find a safe place to work, and they need a platform to work from as well. Yes, and activists. People. In this world, we need those people. They're very valuable, and they sacrifice a lot. I want also to mention the third journalist in the film is Lukeson, and he was the only reporter inside Vani, and he reported to the outside world. And it's actually thanks to him that people got to know of, at least, we got to know that the situation on ground was very different from what the Sri Lankan government said. Mm-hmm. So he is an incredible person that actually was in the war zones and deliberately took photos and interviewed people and sent everything back through his satellite phone out here mainly to the Tamil diaspora. And his footage was also used in BBC and in Channel 4 and in all major channels, the little that came out from the Tamil people in Vani.
Great. Well, it's such a pleasure that you are here to join us. And again, I think that you'll meet some of the folks in our audience either tomorrow in Scarborough or at the Robert Gill Theatre downtown. Any final words that you have about Toronto or your trip here?
I've been here once before. That was when I pitched for my daughter, The Terrorist. So it's great to be back here. Yes, I'm look forward to meeting the audience both tomorrow and on.
And you'll be at the screenings.
I'll be at the screening.
Great.
Yes. So there will be Q&As after the screening. So I'll be happy to answer questions from the audience as well. Yes.
Perfect. There you have it. You have an opportunity to meet Beate as well. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
So there you have it. And this actually ties in very much into what we'll be covering in our second and our third segment, which is this groundbreaking, you can say, report that has come out of the UN. It's been titled the Petrie Report, titled after the gentleman that actually, within the UN, that did this internal review. And it is, I could probably say, somewhat controversial. I'm sure it's making some waves both in New York and in Geneva as well. It is because it is a damning report on the actions and the words of the UN in 2009. So stay with us. We will have two panelists here who've actually been to the Human Rights Council, the UN Human Rights Council sessions in Geneva, and they'll tell you a little bit more about what this report has. You are watching CrossRoads on TVI with Manjula Salvaraja.
which is leading in part to the decimation of religious and ethnic identity of subjugated groups. The army is also responsible for exacerbating harsh conditions for women, particularly young and widowed Tamil women, who are victimized by rampant sexual violence by Sri Lankan soldiers. Racism in areas of language, education, and employment is pervasive and deeply ingrained in Sri Lanka's social, economic, and political structures. For these reasons and more, we request the Special Rapporteur on Racism to make an official visit to Sri Lanka to make an assessment of the underlying structural inequalities and escalating intolerance there, and to report his findings and recommendations to the Human Rights Council. We also call upon the Council to establish an independent commission of inquiry to properly account for the past and present human rights violations committed by the Sri Lankan government. Thank you, Mr. President.
Welcome back to Crossroads on TVI with Manjula Salvaraja. If you do have any questions or comments for our guests, please call us at 416-623-8100. We'd love to hear from you. Some of you would have seen a not-to-be-missed headline in a recent National Post article by journalist Stuart Bell. The headline spoke about a UN report that is that has come out recently. It's called the Petrie Report. The headline was titled, UN Failing Its Duty to Protect Civilians During Conflicts, an internal report on Sri Lanka. Again, it refers to a report that is highly critical of the UN. Here to talk about it are two attendees of the recent session of the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. Now, just for clarity, because we're going to be saying this very often, the UN Human Rights Council will refer to as UNHRC, so that I don't have to keep saying this again and again. So our first guest is Dhamy Rajendra, and she's actually joining us on Skype. She's an active representative at these sessions in Geneva, bringing attention to human rights violations being committed against the Tamils in Sri Lanka and advocating for a political solution to the ethnic conflict. A California-based chartered accountant, she's a member of USTPAC, a USA-based grassroots advocacy organization founded in 2009 committed to working for a political solution to the ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka. Vani Selvarajah is also an active participant at the UNHRC sessions. Vani was recently called to the Ontario Bar in June 2012. She's a graduate of the Bachelor of Laws program from the University of Alberta. Vani is on the board of directors with the Canadian Tamil Congress and does advocacy work through a Canadian-based NGO called Lawyers' Rights Watch. Rights Watch Canada. She has a particular interest in international human rights law. Welcome to the show to both of you.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you on. So Vani, let me start off with you. I think it'd be great to, before we go into talking about the Petrie Report, perhaps you can tell us about the UNHRC and its function.
Well, the Human Rights Council is a branch of the United Nations, and it was actually formed in 2006 by the General Assembly. And there are 47 council members and 192 member states. And the mandate of the Human Rights Council is basically the protection and promotion of human rights. So the Human Rights Council actually meets 3 times a year. They have a 3 to 4 week segment where they discuss human rights issues around the world. So 192 member states take part, and they discuss pertinent issues with respect to human rights violations and protections around the world.
Great. So let's then get into actually talking about this Petrie Report. Now, you know what? Why don't we start out? What is the Petrie Report?
Well, it is, just to give you a bit of background, when the war culminated in May 2009, there was a lot of outrage on what the human rights violations happened in Sri Lanka. So the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon of the United Nations, he put together a panel of experts to take a look at what actually happened in Sri Lanka. And this panel came out with their report in April of 2011. And one of the recommendations, aside from the fact that parties to this war had committed, war crimes or crimes against humanity, was that maybe there were some agencies or individuals who may have been responsible or had made mistakes during the war and how the UN dealt with it. So in response to that, what the Secretary General did was he put together a panel headed by Mr. Petrie, to look into the internal failures of the UN and just review what happened in the final months of the war and how the UN actually responded. So this report actually just came out November 14th, and it shows that, you know, there were several mistakes that were done, and it leaves one wondering whether the UN had responded differently if this many lives would have been lost in the final months of the war.
Okay, so let me put that same question out to Dhamy. Dhamy, can you hear us okay?
Hi, Manjula. Thanks for having me on your show.
A pleasure to have you on. And you just heard Vani talking about sort of the function of the UNHRC and the Petrie report. So can you tell us a little bit about the findings that are revealed in this report?
Certainly. So, you know, in terms of the 6 different failures that the report called for, the main one is that the main message from the report is that the UN mandate is the responsibility to protect civilians, and it failed. And there are, you know, 6 different reasons or areas where it failed. And the first one is, you know, inadequate mandate or understanding, where the UN failed to understand that its main responsibility was to protect civilians. Taking many actions where they were trying to protect or pursuing a humanitarian exercise rather than to say, let's address the events that were unfolding. There were, you know, discussions of ineffective structure and strategy, inadequate experience of staff, all of them leading to, you know, what ended up happening was they weren't publicizing numbers in terms of civilian casualties, and they weren't fighting harder to get access to these areas that were being blocked. And so these were obligations that the UN had to carry out, and the failings of this calls back the overall mandate. And it also talks into, you know, the interactions between the Security Council and the UNHRC and the General Assembly, and how the member states played a key role, or, you know, how their mandate in terms of wanting to have a political view on this ended up influencing the UN actions as well. You know, because the UN didn't address or publicize a lot of this information, the member states, the 47 member states that Vani talked about, didn't have adequate information to make an informed decision to address the war. And so all of these failings point to really the high mandate of the UN, which is the responsibility to protect.
Interesting.
And the Sri Lankan atrocity is the worst 21st century's mass atrocity, you know, that we can look back on. And so when you look back on this is big.
Now, let's look at, I mean, some of the things that they've revealed about staff that were part of the UN mission in Sri Lanka, knowing these numbers. And where do you think I mean, what is the report saying of where that point of failure was? Was it, you know, was it with the staff that were within the country? Was the breakdown when it actually gets to the offices in Geneva and New York, or actually at a higher level when it gets to Ban Ki-moon? What is the report revealing with regards to the point of breakdown? So Dhamy, sorry, that was for you. I don't know if you heard that question clearly.
I did.
Okay.
So I think it points to every level. I think it talks about the fact the senior UN staff members on the ground weren't experienced to handle crises situations. It also talks to how the UN headquarters wasn't doing enough, using enough of its advocacy tools and everything else at its fingertips to bring together the member states. If you kind of look back on what happened back in 2009, the Security Council wanting to, just get an update on the humanitarian situation rather than looking to say, how do we address, how do we stop and get the UN to, if they had communicated to say, government, you need to do this because the consequences of this are war crimes and crimes against humanity. If you were just publish the numbers on the number of casualty, then the world or the member states would have possibly come to a different conclusion. So it calls on the inexperience of the staff, both internally and the lack of communication and the carrying out of the responsibility at UN headquarters as well.
Now, where do you, and Vani, perhaps you can answer this. Why do you think that happened? I mean, there is a structure in place that is there specifically so these layers can sort of report into each other and inform the Human Rights Council and inform the Security Council. So why do you think that broke down? Like, why was some of these? It seems to me that some of these pieces of information were actually suppressed. Why do you think that is?
Well, if you read through this very detailed report, there's a lot of correspondence between the internal actors, the UN. And I think I've said this previously, but I feel like it's a political game. When you look at the UN, I think we fail to realize, we all look at the UN as this international body. But you have to think about the fact that it's actually governments, right? Governments with political interests, geopolitics come into play, right? Like, I mean, if you look at China and Russia and Cuba, for example, they take a certain stance, right? If the US says something, then they have a response to that. And sometimes it feels like human rights gets lost in the midst of all of this. But to answer your question, I think they're actually just losing communication. They want to appease the Sri Lankan government at the same time, because the UN actually, in 2008 of September, when they were entering into the final stages, the Sri Lankan government actually warned the UN personnel that they could no longer guarantee their safety. So they actually took them out of the Vani region and they moved them somewhere else, which made it really hard for them to monitor the humanitarian need when the final stages of the war took place. So it feels like maybe they were doing this, or the amounts of the casualty was actually suppressed to appease the Sri Lankan government, because if you say something that the government is really against, there's a potential that they might just ask the UN to completely leave, right? So I think they were trying to there was a balance of let's stay on the ground, let's have some witnesses, versus actually completely pulling out of Sri Lanka.
That's interesting. Dhamy, I don't know if you'd like to weigh in on that as well?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I just want to add to Vani's point is, this, when you were talking to Beate earlier as well about this, as, there's so much atrocity, there's so much information coming out, and yet there's so little being done. And, I think I look and relate that to the lack of political will. I mean, that's kind of across the board, right? And so when you're looking at all the failings and you look at the UN and say, how could the UN have failed? How could the government have done this? And how could all of these member states not be responding? Or why is the press not, paying attention to this? I think it kind of boils down to lack of political will. And I think, the reason for that is where Sri Lanka is and what it presents, and so there's a lot of political play here that you have to address.
Interesting. So, I mean, I think the next question that I'm going to get to, and I know we'll have to take a break soon, but Vani, I'd like to at least start the discussion is, what are the implications here for the UN? I mean, people from the reports I've been reading, the very few media reports I've been reading on this, there is some indication that they're comparing this to Rwanda. Yeah. So what are the implications for the UN and for Ban Ki-moon here?
Well, this is actually not the first time that the UN has criticized itself for failing to protect civilians. There was an internal review done after the 1994 Rwanda genocide, and then in 1995 the Serbian killings, and now it's Sri Lanka, so this is almost 15 years later. And if you compare the recommendations, it's very similar. It's like, why isn't the Security Council stepping in? Why isn't the Secretary General taking a more aggressive approach to this? And so I think while people are getting excited about this report, I mean, it's amazing that, there's mounting evidence coming out against Sri Lanka with respect to Channel 4 video, all the NGO reports, and this report that's criticizing, the UN itself. And actually, in several places in the report, it says that the Sri Lankan government actually was responsible for a lot of the shelling, something that was, carefully omitted in 2009. So I think, I'm not sure if I'm completely going off on a tangent or if I'm not answering your question or not, but the recommendation in this report is that perhaps we should go forward with a panel of experts recommendations as well, which is to perhaps we are calling for an establishment of an international independent investigation into war crimes and crimes against humanity, because I think the evidence is mounting. There's a lot out there.
Is that what the Petrie report asks for?
They're actually asking for them to go through with a panel of experts recommendations, which the international investigation mechanism is actually mentioned in the panel of experts report. But this report is more about the UN structure. How can we structure it so that another crisis happens and we don't let civilians die, right? How will the UN take a more aggressive approach? So this report is, while it's looking at Sri Lanka, a majority of it, the recommendations, is around the UN structure. How are you going to make sure that your personnel are well equipped to deal with a crisis to this caliber?
Okay, well, we have a ton more questions for both of you about implications, so stay with us. And audience, I ask that you stay with us too. We will take a break now and we'll be back to talk to our two panelists again on the same topic. You're watching Crossroads on TVI with Manjula Salvaraja. Welcome back to Crossroads on TVI with Manjula Salvaraja. If you have a question or comment for our guests, we would love to hear from you. Please call us at 416-623-8100. And I have a question for you, Dhamy. I'm actually curious about just a follow-up to the question that I asked Vani about implications. What do you think the implications are from this report for the UN, Ban Ki-moon? Actually, I'll extend that question to the Sri Lankan government and the diaspora. What do you think the implications are?
Sure, I think that's a great question. So let me start with the Sri Lankan government. If you look back from May 2009, the narrative that the Sri Lankan government has been presenting to the world in terms of this, that being a humanitarian rescue operation and passing a resolution to congratulate the actions taken of defeating terrorism. And then the subsequent Channel 4 video and the panel of experts report, and and we're still not sure about the actual number of people that were killed, and so we're still counting the dead per Francis Harrison's book. So when you kind of look at how the story is changed over time, the government story, it was, from the beginning wasn't holding much water. And so this report is just more evidence, kind of strengthening that story along the way to say how UN also systematically failed in its responsibilities. And so I think that's a healthy trend. In terms of the report, this isn't an actionable report by the Human Rights Council, right? Because this is an internal review of the UN mechanisms. And so it's you can't pass a resolution on this report through the Human Rights Council. So, but what it can do is it's when you're looking back at the war of what had happened and this being a mass atrocity and allegations of war crimes, there's ongoing allegations. And so this report plays a key role into how we need to build that story, or how this can be taken as a positive step towards preventing ongoing human rights violations, because the UN has to pull its act together. The hope is that there will be some stark actions being taken to address the recommendations, and then policies will be put in place, and so this is positive in that. And then it also contributes to building that political will, or that overall awareness of what's happened. So I think for the UN and the Sri Lanka government, that's the implications. For the diaspora, this is all the other things that have been building in terms of the panel of experts review Channel 4 video. This is another thing that I think that helps to highlight what had happened. This is by force again, and I go back and say the worst mass atrocity of the 21st century. This is the world, and the world didn't know about it. When we go and advocate, or we're talking at the Human Rights Council, this gives us an opportunity to talk about the outcome and the recommendations in the internal review panel report. And I think what we have to work towards is building that political will of member states to take action. It has to come down to, we can't be focused on taking a lower stance and addressing the recommendations. That needs to happen for reconciliation as well, but the focus needs to shift to the panel of experts report, and try to build why we need to have an independent international commission of inquiry. This is helpful for that. So I'll stop with that and give you the opportunity, Vani.
Well, first of all, both of you have been to these sessions, and in case I didn't identify it correctly, at the start of our last segment, we saw you, Dhamy, actually addressing the UNHRC at the last session. So perhaps, you're two people that are in the diaspora that have decided to act on this. What is the role that the diaspora can play around this report? What are some of the actions that the diaspora could take?
I think it's trying to get the word out, right? At the end of the day, sometimes I feel like we're preaching to the choir, right? We're talking to the same people about the same issues. We have to write op-eds to newspapers, put your 2 cents in, because as you can see, the evidence is mounting. So now it's time that we get people to listen to us, right? So it's amazing, like these documentaries, these movies coming out. And I think the diaspora should make it a point, first of all, not to lose hope that, that something will eventually happen, but also to talk to people, talk to friends, neighbors, get the word out, right? Because now at the UN, we're trying to get country officials to realize, right? But we have to get people like within our own country, right? People that are non-Tamil to know about what actually happened.
So what's your sense for, I think the next session is in March.
Yeah.
Where do you stand? Optimistic?
I think every time we go in, we are ready for nothing to happen. But if something small happens, then we're happy. But the point is we keep going, whether something happens or not. This is just my first year of going. But I think that there is some positive feedback coming through. March is going to be a very important time just because that it's a follow-up to previous March's resolution. This report is bound to make a lot of
a change in the climate.
Yeah, people talking there and things like that. So March will be very important. I feel like I keep going because I hope something will happen. Hope countries are starting to listen, and you look at our government, for example, too, right? They were quiet, but now look at them. They're actually talking. Prime Minister had said that he will boycott the CHOGM, the head of state government.
The summit, right?
Yeah, next year in Sri Lanka. And so John Baird, Minister of Foreign Affairs, just made a statement after the release of the report saying that, Sri Lanka cannot do this to its people. And I think it's improvement, right? When you look at it in the grand scheme of things, it is improvement. Yes, it's minuscule at times, but we're getting there. So I guess we need to remain hopeful.
So I'll put a final question to both of you, and this is just my own curiosity. Dhamy, I'll start with you. You're a chartered accountant, and I just saw you again speak in that recorded version, YouTube recording that we showed at the UN. Why do you do this kind of advocacy? What drives you?
So I get asked this question quite a lot. And I think if you look at the incredible personal growth, that's I think that's what keeps me going. But in terms of what got me started, May 2009, which just had a very profound effect. And I'm sure that this is for all Tamils. And so, at that time, I felt like I needed to get involved. There was something that I needed to do. Moving on from there, immediately I joined Amnesty, and now I run a local chapter in San Jose. And then kind of just talking about this personal growth, joining USTPAC, and what an incredible opportunity to go to the UN and do this kind of work. I mean, this was when I visited it as a visitor at the UN. I told myself, if I ever had the opportunity to come here, how great would that be? And then I was given that opportunity. And so it's from a personal standpoint, this has been incredible. Just meeting people that completely inspire and are dedicated. We work with a great team. When we're in Geneva, we have other Tamil diaspora groups. British Tamil Forum is a UK-based diaspora Tamil group that is there with us. We have USTPAC and CTC, and as you know, there are many members, very dedicated members. I want to recognize two other members that visit with me, have traveled to Geneva, Dr. Yaso Natkunam and Tasha Manoranjan, Elias Jayaraja, who is the president of USTPAC. All of these folks are just completely dedicated individuals, and it's a pleasure to work with them, and it's such a growth opportunity. So I think here's a huge area where Tamil diaspora can play just a tremendous part.
Vani, I don't know if you want to talk about your own.
Well, what started for me is, I was born in Brunei, never been to Sri Lanka, pretty much raised in Canada. So I didn't have that personal attachment per se, but when May 2009 happened, it just, something changed, right? And it's like, what can you do? And one of my personal mentors, Gary Anandasangri, has been taken an active part in the Human Rights Council ever since then. And I think it was helping him behind the scenes. It was helping him with statements, with research and things like that, that started to make me feel, it would be really interesting if I can actually go there once. And I think actually going there and doing hands-on work and meeting some great people. USTPAC, British Tamil Forum, these are inspiring people. And people at the UN, right, and human rights defenders who put everything aside and actually come to Sri Lanka. And they literally put their lives at risk to advocate for human rights. And it's truly inspiring to be a part of this movement, right? Because we have to realize, I don't know if we'll actually get something today or tomorrow, but it's a movement, and it's amazing.
It's all baby steps.
It's amazing to be a part of it, yeah.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to have both of you on. We'd love to have you come back, perhaps either before, preferably after the session in March. I think there's going to be a lot of interest and a lot of action there. Yeah. So thank you, Vani. Thank you, Dhamy. That's our show today. Thank you all for
Manjula.
My pleasure. That's our show for today. Thank you all for joining us. You've been watching Crossroads on TVI with Manjula Salvaraja.
தமிழரின் பிம்பம் உங்கள் டிவி.